In the gut, we know that serotonin and other neurotransmitters are working. We know that they are involved with the brain, but 95% of serotonin is made in the gut, and also there's several receptors. About 90% of the receptors are there. So you realize then that the gut has this location for serotonin, then there's this communication mechanism. And you realize that as we're eating food and it's getting digested and it's going to the gut, the food is going to interact with neurotransmitters. It's also going to interact with the trillions of microbes that are in the gut microbiome.
Hey, this is Ari. Welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. In this episode, I've put together a mashup of two previous guests who are experts on the relationship between nutrition and mental health. So first up, I have Dr. Uma Naidoo, who is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist and trained nutrition specialist, and she's the author of the national bestseller, This Is Your Brain on Food. Also, this episode features Trudy Scott, who is a certified nutritionist as well as food and mood expert. She's the host of the Anxiety Summit and the author of the Anti-Anxiety Food Solution. Enjoy. So I'd like to sort of create an overview for listeners of how nutrition actually interacts with brain health. What are some of the key, maybe 3, 4, 5 different physiological mechanisms or pathways that nutrition is actually affecting what's going on in our brain and how that ties into mental health?
That's a great question, Ari. So, as research evolves, we understand that there are different mechanisms by which the brain is impacted by food, and some of them include things like oxidative stress, um, as well as I think what is the most important, in my opinion, but amongst others, the gut-brain connection. And this is newer science because it really has evolved in the last 1 to 2 decades, even though Hippocrates, nodded to this in statements that he made eons ago. And Hippocrates really is considered the father of modern allopathic medicine. It took science a long time to catch up. And now that we understand there is this connection between the gut and brain, we were able to understand further that the gut and brain originate from the exact same cells in the human body, the neural crest cells. These cells then divide up and form two different organs in the body, the gut and the brain, but then they remain connected anatomically by the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, which I like to call a two-way text messaging system. And these organs are communicating all the time. But one of the things that we also need to put together is in the gut, we know that serotonin and other neurotransmitters are working. We know that they are involved with the brain, but 95% of serotonin is made in the gut, and also there's several receptors. About 90% of the receptors are there. So you realize then that the gut has this location for serotonin, then there's this communication mechanism. And you realize that as we're eating food and it's getting digested and it's going to the gut, the food is going to interact with neurotransmitters. It's also going to interact with the trillions of microbes that are in the gut microbiome. And those microbes are really there to support our health. We should be taking care of them. And there are trillions of them. But, when our food is broken down, the good microbes, on the days that we are eating a healthy meal, the good microbes are able to help with that process. And the breakdown products are things like short chain fatty acids, which are great for the gut, help to lower inflammation. Another anti-inflammatory foods, another great way to explain this mechanism. And on days that, if we are consuming more of a sugar-laden or say a fast food diet, the what we need to also understand is the breakdown products of those foods can be very toxic to the gut environment. And there are bad microbes that live alongside the good microbes. And when they are fed with sugar and fast foods and stuff like that, their breakdown products are toxic to the single cell lining of the gut. When they damage that lining over time, conditions like leaky gut arise, and the condition in the gut of inflammation is called dysbiosis. So we start to therefore unfold that the food mood connection evolves based on this connection between the gut and brain. And there are several other mechanisms, anti-inflammatory foods, the mechanism of oxidative stress, how we combat that, understanding neuroplasticity, and more. So there are many more different ways. But the one that I feel really captures it for people is when you understand how your food is digested and the fact that the actual digestive products impact that environment and impact your gut. It's a very simple way to think about making that connection come alive for you. And
Mhm.
that's the reason I focus on it. And I wrote my book based on that.
Beautiful. Yeah, I definitely want to dig more into the gut brain axis. Um, I've heard this figure many times before about 90%, 95% of the serotonin that's produced in our body is produced in our gut rather than our brain. And oftentimes this is communicated in a way that it implies that therefore all of that serotonin is sort of modulating our happiness, right? We have this narrative that's been inculcated into the population for many decades now that serotonin is what controls our happiness or depression. Serotonin deficiency equals depression. And if we're depressed, what that means is we have a chemical imbalance that we need to correct with these SSRIs, these specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors. That's sort of the popular narrative that's been around a long time. More recently, I guess to add one more layer to this, there was a paper that recent systematic review that just came out by Moncrieff et al. And showed that the data really does not support the serotonin deficiency imbalance model of depression.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts on, I know there's a lot in there and we can sort of go into this piece by piece, but maybe starting with this piece of what is actually the role of serotonin, whether produced in the gut or the brain? What's the nature of this relationship of serotonin to happiness and depression, in your opinion?
In my opinion, I think that there are a lot of things that we need to be super careful about because science, and especially nutritional science, is ever evolving. I'm aware of the study, and I think that I think it's great that someone brought this information forward. I want to just be clear, though, that anyone listening to this shouldn't, just stop taking their medications without speaking to their doctor because that can be hugely dangerous and have side effects. But that being said, I think, Ari, in my opinion, the way that we diagnose individuals based on the DSM-5 TR is flawed. These are checklists, and humans do not fall into checklists, especially the emotional well being. Someone might have PTSD and a touch of depression. Someone might have anxiety and ADHD. People just simply don't fall into one category. Now, that has been a respected way that all of us have been trained, and I still use it when it's necessary, and I use it as a framework. So we have an issue with diagnostic categories. Then we have an issue, which is something we touched on already, that the system is dedicated towards, yes, therapy is a very important part of treatment, but it's medication driven. Some of that is actually related to how insurance reimbursement happens. So, a psychiatrist in hospitals, for the most part in the United States, psychiatrists are expected in a clinical setting to prescribe a medication as part of their visit. They're often not called on their therapy training to do that. And part of that is related to how reimbursement happens. So if you choose not to prescribe a medication, you may not actually at times be able to follow that patient long term because they sort of get a visit with a psychiatrist. That in itself is flawed because we are trained to do more than just prescribe a medication, but that is the system in itself. Nutrition doesn't even enter the conversation for the
Mm-hmm.
most part. The other piece about it is that serotonin, dopamine, GABA, all of these different chemicals are involved. So we know that it's not just one theory, it's not just one hypothesis, it's not just one substance. We also know that there are many factors that impact mood, anxiety, where serotonin has been implicated. I think that this is super helpful information for us to have. In fact, this year there were two things that were pretty huge in mental health that were unearthed. One was the Moncrief paper, I believe it was from the British Medical Journal. And the other was that some of the findings in the initial core research around Alzheimer's disorder and how the images were done were found to be fraudulent. So billions of dollars of research were done on what we think was fraudulent data,
Wow.
and has led us in a direction around the hypothesis of how we're treating, how we're trying to figure out how we're trying to find a cure. So those are two very big things.
I
And
actually don't know the part about Alzheimer's. Was it that the images were focused on these beta amyloid plaques and or something to that
the
effect?
correct. So they were focused on proving a set of this hypothesis, and the paper was, I believe, more than 15 years ago. Um, but and I forget the details, Ari, of how it came to light, but it's written about all over in the popular press, and it's been published in a journal
Mhm.
that someone re-examines, an expert re-examined these images, and these images were tainted and found to be tweaked in a way that
Wow.
seemed to imply a certain outcome.
Wow.
Then that outcome was what everyone based their research grants on, because it was now a proven hypothesis, let's call it.
Hmm.
And so I feel that just taking those two things and the work that I do into account, I realize in a very humble way, we really don't know the answers.
Hmm.
So when you ask me about serotonin, what I can say is it's involved. I have seen people improve their symptoms, like the patient I mentioned, on a small dose of Prozac and feel better. How much of that was the therapeutic relationship, his changes to his lifestyle and nutrition, the actual medication? It's really not clear.
Yeah.
So I'm not trying to avoid answering the question. I'm saying that it's multifactorial,
Right.
and that this is where an integration of research and clinical skills and being able to actually talk to a patient is hugely important. A lot of really brilliant people put out tons of data on nutritional psychiatry or nutrition or mental health, um, and never see a patient. And I think there's an issue with that.
Hmm.
So in integrating it, I will tell you that people have done well on with nutritional and lifestyle measures, because I practice a method that is really a holistic, integrated, and functional. So it's not just one thing, but nutrition is a pillar. I can also say that the integration of actually speaking to someone and tracking symptoms is hugely important. And when you realize that someone can be depressed due to a life event, a huge loss. So, it may not be the loss of a loved one. It could actually be the loss of a job. It could be the loss of an identity. It could be so many different things. You also realize that, someone with a head injury can suffer from depression or anxiety or other symptoms in mental health. There's a whole subspecialty of psychiatry that deals with that. When you put this together, I think the best we can do is assess someone clinically, you know, do the best we can to offer them a really thorough evaluation of what's going on, and then test to see what could work for them. And I don't always use medication. In someone who is able to function, I might use lifestyle measures first. But I'm a trained psychiatrist, and I therefore feel comfortable at least being able to assess someone's safety. So that is one of the most important things in mental health, is if someone is safe, they're not suicidal, they are not so severely depressed, you can use other methods alongside that. But sometimes in the emergency room or the clinic, or the acute care clinic, you see someone who's actively very either manic, psychotic, has lost touch with reality, or depressed. So very long answer, but I'm hoping you know I'm open to conversation about it, but I'm hoping you see what I'm trying to say about the breadth of the number of things going on.
Yes, absolutely. I guess a couple more questions related to neurotransmitters. And this might be hard to answer, but to what extent do you think mental health issues can be explained by neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain versus other mechanisms?
I think it's one of many different things, and I don't think that all of it is actually fully known. Um, so I think they play a role. Do I think they're the only thing? No. Um, I think that they do impact mood, they do impact symptoms, and we need to include them in the conversation. But we may not need to rely on them as much as we did. Now, that being said, that's where speaking to uh, a trained psychiatrist or a clinician who can evaluate your symptoms and decide if you need a medication becomes important. Medications are not always needed. But here's the other thing, um, there are there are probably mechanisms that we don't know yet that we are still researching. One of the exciting areas of research is really finding solutions through food, so psychobiotics, and or through nutrients. And so, can these actually be taken by individuals to feel emotionally better and to offset symptoms, but be in the form of a food or nutrient? And by manipulation of the gut microbiome, the gut microbes. So I think that as those types of solutions are added to, say, the buffet of solutions that we have, I think that becomes important too, so that we don't just have what I feel like mental health relies on, which is pulling out a prescription pad and giving you a medication when you leave your doctor's office, because it doesn't always work. And I think we also know from research that, for example, in anxiety, it's been shown that, only a certain percent of people actually get better. For the large part, most individuals may not have a full treatment of their symptoms, may still be suffering, and some are not touched by the medication at all.
Mhm.
So,
Gotcha. So, as far as the gut brain axis is concerned, and I know you've mentioned some of these in passing, but what would you say are the sort of two or three key pathways to understand about that relationship between what's going on in the gut and the brain, to understand how the gut health affects brain health?
sure. So I think understanding firstly that connection and how food is broken down, and a healthy food versus a less healthy food, and what that impact is. The second is the actual gut environment. Now, those gut microbes perform many functions for us. They are helping with hormone production, vitamins, sleep and circadian rhythm, which is our internal body clock. They're helping with our immunity. 70% of the immune system is in the gut. So, super important at a time like now and beyond. So, they're doing lots of things, plus impacting mental health. As they are acting, one of the ways that they act is they interact with food. We need to understand that they are producing byproducts, they are interacting that gut environment, they are impacting inflammation or fighting off inflammation. So they are functioning as well. And then the third component to realize is, in this environment, there's a very uh, delicate single cell layer that is the lining of the gut. And that lining is easily damaged. So when you are producing more toxic substances, that lining gets damaged, and these cells have something called tight junctions. When those are pretty easily damaged, there's leakage, and you get conditions like leaky gut or intestinal permeability. And with these toxic substances then enter the circulatory system. So you start to realize the gut and brain are connected. Then if there's leakage, this is all going to reach and go back to other parts of the body, but it's also going to go back to the brain. And this is where neuroinflammation gets set up. And neuroinflammation, one of the other mechanisms by which or which we are considering in this whole emerging field, becomes important. There's some really top researchers in cognitive health and Alzheimer's, like my colleague Dr. Rudy Tanzi at Mass General, and one of the things he really firmly believes is that neuroinflammation can be reduced in its early stages by how you eat, like your lifestyle measures, a plant-rich diet, anti-inflammatory foods, fiber-rich foods. One of the ways that you can actually lower that inflammation in your brain simply by how you eat.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. What about productions of vitamins and neurotransmitters in the gut? And we mentioned serotonin already, but I know GABA is another neurotransmitter that's produced in the gut. I know that last I looked into this maybe a year or two ago, it seemed that there was some controversy around the role of GABA in the gut. And some theories were suggesting maybe it travels through the vagus up into the brain. Other theories were saying that maybe it just signals the vagus detects the presence of GABA in the guts and then in the gut and then signals something to the brain. So it modulates brain expression just via nerve signals. What would you say overall about the importance of vitamin and neurotransmitter production in the gut related to mental health?
I think it's hugely important, and I think that there's always updates to research and how we're thinking, um, and in my in my more than 20 years experience of sort of doing this work, one of the things that I feel is that say we know that there are different ways that GABA interacts. We know that GABA is important. We know that serotonin is important. We know that we now know that the gut microbiome is important, and we know that these gut microbes are effective. I want to use the example of omega-3 fatty acids here. Just take a second to do this. As someone practicing mental health, we often will lean on omega-3 fatty acids as a supplement, or in my case, I prefer to suggest food sources for individuals. And for the most part, this is one supplement that many psychiatrists actually do lean on. They will, often include that in a treatment plan, and we know that there's a lot of good data on improvement of mood, help with cognition, help with anxiety, and others. There was a very big study published in December of last year by colleagues of mine who looked at a geriatric population of individuals and found that omega-3s did not help geriatric depression. So again, this was a well done study, well researched, and should it mean that, I would never give that supplement or suggest that food to an elderly patient? No, because more and more we're also moving towards highly personalized medicine. And the gut microbiome in each person is like a thumbprint. So more and more we have theories, we have scientific theories, we have ongoing research, thank goodness, we're learning all the time, but we also have the individual. And I think that's where it becomes important to integrate that there's ongoing research like you shared about GABA, but it's hugely important to understand the gut plays a role in vitamin production and hormone production and neurotransmitters, and it may be different for each person. Now, take vitamin D, for example. We get 80% of our vitamin D by spending 10 minutes of time outdoors in actual daylight, not through a window, because of how vitamin D is produced. So I think that understanding these little nuances, knowing that, vitamin B9, folate, you get a ton of it from leafy greens. Low folate is associated with low mood. Um, so as you put together the facts that we've known or we learn from research with what is going on in the person's body in a personalized way, and you understand that the gut is hugely important and integral to these different mechanisms, it becomes important. I also think the other thing is food. Food impacts all of this, and that's where I think food is a powerful tool to help all of us.
Excellent. So getting into sort of more practical stuff around specific mental health conditions and specific foods, what would you say are some of the biggest specific foods or nutritional factors that relate to one's risk of depression?
So the foods that you want to be careful about are very important, because many people consume foods and they worry about their waistline or their weight gain, and they don't realize that these foods are actually impacting their mental health. So the typical Western diet, called the standard American diet or SAD diet for a reason, um, is rich in sort of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, processed, ultra processed foods, lots of stabilizers, food coloring, etc. And they do cause weight gain, but they also have very devastating effect on our brain. And so a lot of foods that we consider so-called comfort foods are discomfort for the brain. A lot of foods that are treats, called treats by individuals, actually mistreat the brain. And a lot of the things like artificial sweeteners that disrupt, many of the artificial sweeteners are disruptive to the gut microbiome. Um, the unhealthy fats, the hydrogenated fats and the processed vegetable oils, are just not great for us because they're disruptive to the gut. They're pro-inflammatory. They upset the omega-3 to omega-6 ratio in the body. And gut inflammation ultimately leads to brain inflammation, and they become problematic because inflammation is seen as one of the underlying mechanisms for things like cognition, cognitive disorders, depression, anxiety, and more. Um, so when we break it down in that way, we realize that there are foods that we want to cut back on and be careful about. But the foods that you can lean into, one of the biggest foods is fiber. It's one of the nutrients that most Americans don't consume. We tend to be worried about the grams of protein we're consuming, but we don't consume nearly enough fiber. So a big database study showed that I think 1 or 2 out of every 10 Americans eats enough fiber. Yet fiber, which we get from plants, fruit, beans, nuts, seeds, legumes, and whole grains, actually nurture those gut microbes and feed them. So they need fiber in order to function. So any fiber-rich food is something that you can lean on. Um, Prebiotics, probiotics, and fermented foods, another huge group that actually can help offset mood symptoms. The study that looked at the use of a probiotic supplement versus Prozac showed that the supplement did better. So even eating a probiotic-rich diet can help you. Fermented foods, a huge study from a research group out of Stanford, a highly respected group, looked at fermented foods and was published in Cell in summer of 2021. And this showed that actually eating fermented foods and adding this to your diet can reduce the amount of inflammation. So hugely helpful those sort of that group of foods. Omega-3 fatty acids, like we mentioned, which you can get from fatty fish, wild caught salmon, and other types of fatty fish, but you also can get plant-based sources from things like flax seeds, sea algae, and more. The plant-based sources do have the short chain omega-3s less efficiently, um, transmitted to the brain, let's say, but still worth including in your diet. So those are just some of the foods to think about. And then one of the ones I always like to mention, which I think are the hidden gems in our kitchen cabinet, are spices. Saffron and turmeric have been shown to be extremely helpful in terms of mood. So depression definitely something to consider, and for turmeric, always add a pinch of black pepper.
Hmm. What are your thoughts on artificial sweeteners? Do you feel they're
So for
safe? Are they safe in
yeah,
general? Are they a risk for mental health or brain health in particular?
so they unfortunately don't do well in mental health for the most part. The older sweeteners, there's some newer ones that are showing some. I would say some better science in the research, but we don't have all the mental health data on them yet. So for the most part, if you had drinking a diet soda and you have anxiety, that could be very problematic for you. Um, uh, Artificial sweeteners can offset symptoms, and I've seen that happen. One clinical example is someone who was trying to actually give up soda, moved to diet soda, and became more anxious. So even though the sugar-laden soda, the 20 grams of sugar in I think it was a 12 to 16 ounce bottle, or maybe 20-ounce bottle, um, of soda wasn't great for the brain either. The artificial sweetener unfortunately set up the anxiety. So some of the newer sweeteners, one of them is allulose. Stevia and erythritol have a better relationship with insulin. So if my patients come in and they just have to have something sweet, and anything in moderation, a little bit of stevia, a little bit of erythritol, a little bit of maybe allulose. There are even newer ones coming out on the market that I've heard about through my work with the World Economic Forum. So, what I can say is be careful with sweeteners, use them in moderation. Really try to move away from things like diet sodas. Read to see what sweeteners in them. Um, One caveat is stevia can set off anxiety in people, and studies have shown this. So if you do suffer from anxiety, be a little bit careful with stevia, because although it's natural, for some reason it doesn't always do well in people with anxiety.
Interesting. Interesting. Um, what about anxiety? Is it sort of the same as far as, and you just mentioned one thing with sweeteners there, but is it
Yeah.
sort of the same as the list with depression as far as the foods and the nutritional factors that affect that, or are there some key differences?
There are some key differences because there are slight nuances with every one of the mental health conditions. Um, you know, with anxiety, one of the foods that you can lean into is tryptophan, which is a precursor of serotonin. But tryptophan actually has been shown to help anxiety, and in some countries like Canada, it's a supplement that needs to be prescribed. But you can get tryptophan from things like chickpeas. You can get it from certainly certain types of poultry. And then there are vitamins that have been shown to be helpful, and minerals. And the reason I mention the minerals is magnesium is often overlooked, but magnesium can be significantly helpful for anxiety, as well as potassium and selenium. You know, you get enough selenium from one or two Brazil nuts a day that you can eat. So that's always a good one to lean into. And then there are some herbs that people often brush aside as unimportant, but lavender, passion flower, and chamomile can actually help people with anxiety. And then vitamins they can lean into are vitamin D. We mentioned sunlight, 10 minutes of outdoor time, vitamins B1, B6, A, C, and E. So the foods, you know, and what I did in my book, Ari, is in the final chapter, I share recipes, but for these different foods and these different vitamins, I list the vitamin and the type of food so people have a checklist that they can go to because it's hard to remember everything.
It's an area that I focus on with my clients, and it's using an amino acid as a supplement to boost your own levels of neurotransmitters. We want to have good energy, and there's specific amino acid. There's one specific amino acid that can actually boost energy, but there's also two that I use that can help with the mood aspect, the anxiety aspect, the low mood, which will help with sleep as well. So if you're not sleeping well, that's going to drain your energy as well. So other than the aspect of what you just mentioned, when you have a terrible fear, you have terrible anxiety, you're worrying all the time, which is energy draining. If you're not sleeping well, that's also going to impact your energy levels. And, you know, I got into this because of my own anxiety and my own panic attacks. And I remember that first panic attack coming out of what seemed like the blue. I had no idea what it was. I'd never experienced anxiety before. You know, I was a adventurer, traveled around the world. I was a rock climber. I met my husband on a cliff face. We got married in the mountains. I did ice climbing. You know, I wouldn't have considered myself an anxious, timid kind of person, but because of biochemistry, because of food sensitivities, because of toxins, because of, you know, some dietary changes that I made, I, you know, messed up my biochemistry, and it caused the anxiety and panic attacks. And that first panic attack hit me, and I, you know, couldn't breathe. I was hyperventilating. I've got to get some air. I've got to get some oxygen. Help, you know, what's going on? And I just remember being absolutely drained afterwards, and you know, not knowing what was going on. And then I had a few more panic attacks, and every time it's draining and it's exhausting. And then, you know, it took me a number of years to find all the solutions, but just that ongoing anxiety is terribly draining. You know, the feeling of waking in the early hours with this feeling of doom and not being able to put your finger on it. Why am I feeling this feeling of doom? There's nothing out there. There's no trauma. There's no reason for feeling like this. And you just have this feeling of impending doom. And that in itself is very draining. And then for some folks, if it's low serotonin, and we'll go into all of these different categories as we go through this, but for some folks, meeting and replaying a discussion they've had with someone, or replaying some article that they've read that they're worried about, and all of that is very draining. So there's many different aspects, and you're right, it's very subjective. Some people won't even use the word anxiety. They'll just say, I've just got this, I just don't feel normal. And then a lot of people will say, I've been like this my whole life. I didn't know I could feel any different. So it is very subjective, but we want to feel our absolute best. So going back to the question, we use these targeted individual amino acids. So we use them one at a time. They're targeted, they're used for your own unique biochemistry, and they are used, you don't just say, take 500 milligrams of tryptophan and then you're fine. You need to find out what are your unique needs, because each person may have different needs. Someone may need more, someone may need it more frequently. And then we titrate. So we'll start low, and I'll talk about dosing and everything as we go through this, but you start low based on your symptoms, and then you increase based on your needs. And then if you get to a point where you don't need that, then you back down. Now for me, I call myself a GABA girl. GABA was my amino acid that really helped me. I also use tryptophan, and we'll talk about those in a second. But the main thing is the amino acids give results very quickly. So you will get relief pretty quickly if you have low GABA, if you have low serotonin, if you have low catecholamines, which is the energy, the one that's really tied to energy, you will get relief from those symptoms, and then you can address some of these other underlying root causes that may have caused the low neurotransmitters in the first place, maybe gluten sensitivity, parasites, heavy metals, you name it. So it gives people hope, it gives them results right away. The other thing which is really nice, Ari, is it helps stop that addiction. It helps stop those cravings. And, if someone's feeling really bad, they've got no energy, they can't sleep, they've got anxiety, and now you're telling them to take away foods that they love, that they, self-medicate with, that they use to feel good, that can be difficult. So the other great benefit of the amino acids is it helps break that addiction. It helps remove that comfort, that need for reward, that need for comfort eating. So it makes it easier to quit the sugar. It makes it easier to quit the gluten, or whatever else needs to be changed in terms of dietary changes.
Gotcha. So I have a question. This is something that I've tried to look into. I have not gotten a clear answer to it, and there seems to be, as far as I can tell, somewhat divergent opinions among experts, and that is the use of these individual amino acids. If somebody is eating an otherwise amino acid sufficient diet and protein sufficient diet, let's say, has adequate amounts of tryptophan and taurine and many of the other amino acids that are often precursors of neurotransmitters, in those cases, is there a unique benefit or a different mode of action of using these amino acids in isolation?
That's a good question. And it comes down to each person's needs. So someone may be eating beautiful grass-fed red meat and wild salmon, but maybe they don't have enough hydrochloric acid, so they're not breaking down the protein. So they're not getting the benefits of those amino acids. Or maybe someone has some kind of genetic polymorphism like MTHFR, and it's expressing, therefore they're not able to make their serotonin. We know that the hormones play a huge role. They're very intertwined with the neurotransmitters. So maybe you've got low progesterone, and that's going to affect your GABA levels, or you've got low estrogen, that's going to affect your serotonin levels. We know women make less serotonin than men, so there's that aspect as well. If someone's on the birth control pill, for example, that's going to deplete your B6, it's going to deplete zinc levels, which has a direct impact on serotonin levels. So even if someone is eating a perfect diet, there are all of these other factors that could lower the neurotransmitter levels. Now, the ideal is to get someone to use the neurotransmitter precursors, the amino acids, to start boosting their levels, but then we want to address all these underlying factors. We can't just say, well, just supplement and not do all the other changes. And, I've had some people who seem to be, eating a really healthy diet, and they still benefit from the neurotransmitter support. So it is very, very unique, but it's a great point.
Do you think, is there any research to show that, let's say, taking isolated amino acids on an empty stomach, not in the context of a meal, are metabolized in a different way than they would be in the context of a meal?
Yes, absolutely. They are all should be used on an empty stomach. So they're taken away from protein so it doesn't compete for absorption with the other amino acids in that protein containing food. Now, there are a few little variations. Tryptophan, which supports serotonin levels, definitely needs to be taken away from protein containing foods. 5-HTP, which also supports serotonin, doesn't necessarily need to be, but just for ease of use, it's just easier for folks to just take it away from protein containing food. Yeah, so it definitely does make a difference. And the ideal, is to take it away from protein.
So what specifically is going on there? How do we explain that? Is it that like proteins, amino acids in the context of a meal are more likely to be involved in protein synthesis, whereas the isolated amino acids are more likely to go to the brain for neurotransmitter support? How does that work?
I don't think we really know. Some of it's going to the brain, some of it's impacting the gut. We know that, the microbiome has a huge impact. We know we make a lot of serotonin in the gut. We know that serotonin support helps with motility. So maybe it's helping with synthesis in the gut as well. Maybe some of it's going to the brain. So we don't have all the answers. Certainly with GABA, we don't really know. There's a big myth that GABA doesn't even work. A lot of people will say, well, GABA doesn't even work. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. But we know we have these receptors in other parts of the body. And with GABA, it's more physical tension. And when people use GABA, they'll just feel their sort of physical tension ease. So it may be that it's affecting receptors in other parts of the body. So, yeah, we don't have all the answers.
Okay, so talk to me about the key neurotransmitters. And, I'm sure you could answer this question with a 2-hour answer if you wanted to, but just if you could do a very succinct sort of rundown of what are the key neurotransmitters for people to be aware of, and what are a few of the symptoms or sort of traits associated with those neurotransmitters.
Okay, let's start with low GABA. So with low GABA, GABA stands for gamma aminobutyric acid, and it's our calming neurotransmitter. And it's with the low GABA, you will feel anxiety. You may have panic attacks. You may have some fear. There's some new research that talks about how it helps with inhibition of unwanted thoughts. So most of the time we think of low serotonin when we think about that sort of thinking aspect, but there is some new research showing that GABA can help with the having these sort of thoughts that you don't want. But the main thing that when I think about low GABA, I think about this physical tension. So people will, be sitting with these tense shoulders, tension in the neck. They may have physical pain in their, other parts of the body. They may lie awake at night. So sleep is a big issue with low GABA. Problems with sleep is a big issue, and this lying in bed physically tense. And then the other thing that we see, and which we see with all of the low neurotransmitters, is this addiction aspect and this need to self-medicate. And the big clue with low GABA is often it's alcohol. Like at the end of the day, I've just got to have that glass of wine, and it becomes 2 glasses, 3 glasses, 4 glasses, a bottle, and you self-medicating in order to feel calm. And, there's an issue in itself with alcohol in terms of energy levels. It, it can actually make you sleep worse. But it's used, like a drug. It's used to self-medicate with to feel good. But the problems with alcohol, it depletes you of zinc, magnesium, B6. It damages the gut lining. So that's not something that we want to be relying on. So we've got these symptoms. We look at the symptoms that I've just described, the physical anxiety, the needing for alcohol or something. Sometimes people will use sugar to relax, using something to relax. And then this physical tension. And I'll have my clients rate their symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10, and then we'll trial some GABA. We'll use a GABA supplement. Now, a lot of people will hear about GABA, they'll rush out and buy 500 milligrams or 750 milligrams, and that's way too high for most people to start. So the starting dose I'll use is 125 milligrams, and we'll, I'll do a trial there and then with my client. So we can get immediate feedback. You get feedback within 5 minutes if you haven't eaten. So I'll say before we meet, don't eat within an hour before we meet, and I'll do this trial of GABA. And they might say, I'm feeling anxious and I've got this physical tension. It's like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. and we'll try the GABA, and they can say, yeah, within 5 minutes, you'll just see them go, that felt like a glass of wine. You know, that's the feeling we're looking for. A lot of people can relate to that feeling, and they can feel that immediate relaxation. And it can go down from an 8 or a 9 out of 10 to maybe a 6 or a 7. For some people, it may go down to a 4 or 5 out of 10, depending on, how much they need. Some people may need to, bump that up to double that in that same trial to see, okay, my starting dose is not actually 125, it's a little bit higher. And then I'll have them dose that when they need it through the day. GABA is used through the day in between meals, and then also at night. Now, a lot of people will need higher amounts at night to help them sleep, and they're going to have restful sleep, and then they're going to have better energy through the rest of the day. And I mentioned earlier about the whole GABA blood-brain barrier issue. There is more and more research. There's not as much research as we would like, but we are seeing more and more research. A recent paper came out looking at GABA and theanine and how that improves sleep. And this is a combination. So some people do well just on GABA. Others, we will add in a little bit of theanine as well. But it's the synergistic effect of those two can help. Now, keep in mind with the anxiety and with the sleep issues, it may not just be low GABA. It could also be low serotonin.
Nice. So next neurotransmitter, let's talk about serotonin. So what are the sort of symptoms and traits that would be associated with deficiencies in this neurotransmitter?
So with low serotonin, there's also anxiety. There's also this worry. I mentioned the ruminations, the rethinking, sleep problems, also very common. The main thing with low serotonin compared to the low GABA is it's in the head, more so than GABA. The worry, the panic, the fear, the phobias, anyone who's having panic attacks, classically it's a low serotonin. There's other symptoms that we may not think about as being mood issues, like imposter syndrome, this sort of lack of confidence, the feeling like, who am I to be doing this? The irritability, anger issues. I've worked with a number of kids with terrible explosive anger issues, and sugar cravings and sleep problems, and they turn out to be low serotonin. The winter blues, that's very commonly related to low serotonin taking a dip in the winter time. And there's actually one paper showing that there's winter anxiety as well. More people can be more anxious in the winter because of serotonin taking a dip. PMS, and then of course, as with all the neurotransmitter deficiencies, this need to self-medicate and with something, usually carbohydrates with serotonin, but that's not always the case. It could be alcohol, but it's typically carbs. And with low serotonin, the clue that it's a low serotonin craving or addiction is that it tends to be late afternoon or evening. And that's when serotonin takes a dip. So if you having those kind of carbs, that could be a clue that it's low serotonin. And again, I'll have my clients rate their symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10. We'll do a trial of either tryptophan or 5-HTP. And I'll tell you in a second when I use one versus the other. But again, it's used sublingually in the trial. So opening up a capsule, the starting dose for tryptophan is 500 milligrams. For tryptophan, for 5-HTP, it's 50 milligrams. But opening up that capsule and putting it on the tongue to get those results right away. Now, using them, once someone's figured out, do I need tryptophan or do I need GABA? Using them sublingually, I have found is the most effective way. Some of them don't taste that good. The tryptophan is pretty bitter. That can be used with a little bit of inositol, or maybe mix into a little bit of mashed up banana or apple sauce can help with the taste. But a lot of people just get used to it because they get such good benefits. And I think some of the benefits using it sublingually, firstly, you're getting it's getting into the system very quickly. But the other thing is, if some people have digestive issues, it may be that it's helping in that aspect as well. Now, so someone will rate their symptoms on a scale of 1 to 10. We'll trial the amino acid, and then we'll see how quickly they get results. Now we know that, yes, low serotonin is something we need to be thinking about, and the timing for tryptophan or 5-HTP supplements are mid-afternoon, because that's when serotonin starts to go down, and then in the evening, and maybe someone may need more in the evening if they've got the sleep problems. And then tying this back to energy levels, if you are obviously not having this worry, this constant worry, that's going to help with your energy levels. But if you're sleeping better, then that's going to obviously help with your energy levels as well. Now, there is more. I said I'd tell you when I use tryptophan versus 5-HTP. So I typically start with tryptophan. There is some controversy. Some people are not big fans of tryptophan. They're concerned that it may go down the wrong pathway and cause problems. I have not seen that to be an issue. I use tryptophan just because I've had good results with it, but there are some instances where some people do better on one versus the other. So if tryptophan doesn't work, we'll switch to 5-HTP. There is one study that showed that 5-HTP can raise cortisol levels. So if someone does have high cortisol, I would be cautious, but I have actually had some people where their cortisol is high and they get on 5-HTP and they do great. So it is really a matter of doing a trial and seeing how you do. Most of the research in this area is with 5-HTP. We've got a lot of studies on 5-HTP and fibromyalgia, 5-HTP and pain, 5-HTP and insomnia. But because they are both supporting serotonin, we can extrapolate to tryptophan as well. One very nice study on tryptophan helping with PMS. It was a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. So we do have some tryptophan research. But the main thing is that it people get results and it works. I love the research, and I love to quote the research and show that there is research, but I also, am a big fan of showing what works. One study that I did want to quote in this area is, it's a study was actually using caffeinated fruit flies. Can you imagine all of these little fruit flies buzzing around after having been given caffeine? But they used fruit flies to show how this combination of GABA and 5-HTP had these neuromodulation effects. And the interesting thing is, which I didn't realize until I read the study, is that the circadian regulation in fruit flies is comparable to those in mammals, and when you're looking at sleep research. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So I'm guessing that's why they chose the fruit flies. But they found that using this combination of GABA and 5-HTP modulates subjective nighttime activity, sleep episodes, and total duration of subjective nighttime sleep to a greater extent than single administration of each amino acid. And this occurs via GABA and serotonin signaling. Now, I love studies like this. In this particular one, it showed that the combination was more effective, but keep in mind, each person has their own unique biochemistry. Some people do great with GABA on its own, some need GABA and theanine, some do fine with GABA and tryptophan. So it's a matter of figuring out what's going to work for each person.
Gotcha. Did you say, is it just a personal preference issue, which one works better, or do you have some specific symptoms or traits that determine whether you use 5-HTP or tryptophan?
It's personal preference. I had a lot of good results with tryptophan, so I start with that. I know some other practitioners prefer to start with 5-HTP and then go to tryptophan. So that's what's worked for me, and that's what I continue to do. Yeah.
Gotcha.
There is the issue of tryptophan possibly converting to quinolinic acid. I know Dr. Shaw from Great Plains is not a fan of tryptophan for that reason. He's very against tryptophan for that reason.
That it converts to what acid?
Quinolinic acid.
Quinolinic, okay.
Which is, can be a problem. There's a lot of research, as you know, on quinolinic acid and Alzheimer's, and it's neuroinflammatory. I have not seen that to be an issue. They've got a marker on the organic acid test that shows high quinolinic acid levels, and they say if it's high, don't use tryptophan. I've had people come into me that didn't know they had high levels on that test, use tryptophan with success, and then after the fact found it. So I'm not sure if it is an actual concern. There is some research showing that if you've got sufficient levels of vitamin B6, that can prevent that tryptophan going down the wrong pathway, and it can be used to make serotonin. And then, of course, once you've got good serotonin levels, that's going to help us make melatonin, which helps us sleep as well.
There's obviously, serotonin is this most famous neurotransmitter. Everyone knows about serotonin. Everybody knows depression. The narrative that Big Pharma has promoted, depression is a chemical imbalance. Depression is serotonin deficiency. We need specific serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressant drugs. And my understanding of things, and I'm sure you've delved into this much deeper than I have, but my understanding of things is there definitely is research linking serotonin imbalances to depression and mood disturbances. And yet there's also research showing that these SSRI antidepressant drugs are often no better than placebo. What is your take on that? Is it that the drugs don't work, or is it that long-term versus short-term, the body makes adaptations? Or what's your take on sort of why those two things could both be the case?
Well, the research, so a lot of people will use that argument that it's not a brain chemical imbalance. And I think it's possibly because of an aversion to maybe using medication. So there's that part. It'll be often functional medicine practitioners or nutritionists. And then we do know that with the SSRIs, that a small subset of people respond to SSRIs, and it's often a short-term benefit, and then over time they might start to get a lot of side effects. And a lot of people will come to work with me because they want to stop using their SSRIs. And I do work with people who are wanting to taper from the SSRIs. I work in conjunction with the doctor and make sure that the doctor's on board, and that we support them nutritionally before we even consider a taper, but it's always working with the doctor, and the doctor's monitoring them. But the problem is with the side effects. And there are some people who are on SSRIs long-term and they do great. So, I don't want to just say SSRIs are bad, but they are, it's a difficult question to answer. They are, I think the main thing is not to say because of people saying that the SSRI research is making that connection, and now we must just need to throw that whole theory out. There is, I believe there is definitely that connection. The problem is for some people the SSRIs are working, for some that they're not, and then for others we're getting all these side effects.